still for anyone online who may not have been able to hear, Jason brought up a lot of the non-instrumental churches of Christ during the Civil War era. They were also pacifist. It wasn't completely uniform within the Restoration movement, but yeah, there was a large contingent in the South. So why do I bring this up? Well, I bring it up to show that it's not exactly an easy question. I think it can be resolved. Actually, I should say I do think it can be resolved pretty easily as to whether Christians should or should not be pacifist. But it is something that a lot of Christians question or struggle with.
Seventh-day Adventists, right?
Do we count them?
Well, yeah. I mean, just as a, if you threw,
broader.
You should definitely throw.
Okay. Yeah. So I get. He says Seventh-day Adventists are also. They also tend to be pacifist. There are some different passages that pacifists will turn to support their argument from Scripture. So, for one, if we go over to Matthew 5:39, does someone want to read that for us? Actually, I want to read a couple verses around it. All right, Landra 5, and then verses. We'll do 38 through 30 or through 42.
Okay. An eye for an eye. You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if someone wants to sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. If someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you.
Thank you. So this is one passage they'll turn to. Another one, which we've already read, is kind of the more KJV type translated Sixth Commandment, which, as we mentioned last week, is translated "Thou shalt not kill." Back when the King James Version was translated, that would have included murder. Now, we tend to use kill as a broader term than murder, whereas murder is the unjustified form. Killing is just, in general, the taking of human life. Or, well, actually, it's really just the taking of life. Could be human, could be animal, could be plant. We mentioned last week several reasons for why that's not the accurate translation. It was when the King James was originally translated. It no longer has the same meaning in English today. But then they also bring up this passage from Jesus about turning the other cheek. Now, I do think it's important to recognize this passage is telling Christians we don't need to be completely worried about getting even one for one in this life. That's not supposed to be our worry or concern. I think there's also a good lesson in patience and long-suffering in here when he talks about going the extra mile. What that comes from is under Roman law, they could force a citizen or a subject to carry if a soldier came up on them, they could force them under the law to take their different packs and equipment and just help them travel for 1 mile. They could only go up to 1 mile, and they had mile markers all throughout the Roman Empire. Jesus was, and obviously it was an inconvenience for people whenever they were told they had to do that. There's reasons for doing it with the civil authority, trying to move troops around efficiently, but it's still an inconvenience. The Jews did not like it. Jesus was telling his followers, though, if it happens, be willing to go with them 2 miles. Be willing to go the extra mile, to have that kind of patience. Now, the question is, does that apply to when someone is coming against you with lethal force? Now, I would argue it's not for a couple reasons. Number one, turning the other cheek as an idiom means more of someone's insulting you or is making, being hit in the cheek, that is not considered all that much in terms of force. You would not be justified if that's all someone's doing to you in returning with lethal force. And what we see here, none of these examples have to do with lethal force. We have the force of law, whether it's with the soldiers or with the lawsuit, but it's nothing quite like lethal force.
Yeah, the only really difficult statement is the general statement at the beginning, do not resist an evil person. That makes it sound like, if anyone's doing evil, you're not supposed to do anything about it.
Yeah.
So just taking that out of context, that's where you would get the pacifism. But then in context, like you're saying, the slap on the face, going an extra mile, these aren't life-threatening situations that
Yes.
Jesus is talking about.
Then there's a couple other things we can see that if pacifism is saying one cannot use violence ever, well, then we run into clear problems with Paul and the Old Testament permitting the death penalty for certain kinds of high-level crimes. The civil authority obviously has to be able to exercise that power, or there's not going to be any kind of deterrent factor for major crimes, and that's going to prevent the civil authority from being able to do an effective job. God has clearly endorsed cases where violence is supposed to be used. In the book of Kings, we actually see an instance where David did not execute one of his sons, Absalom, who had murdered a brother for a lot of different reasons. Hard to get into that now, but what was owed to Absalom would have been the death penalty in that instance. David chose to exile him instead of bring out the death penalty, and it leads to a chain of events that causes a Jewish civil war. It's a really bad situation. Could have been avoided if David had done his job in the office of king. Obviously, that's really difficult to have to execute one's own son, but that was his office. That was his responsibility to do that. And when he didn't do it, it caused a lot of problems later on. The other thing we can see to define do not resist an evildoer is that later on in the Gospels, Jesus does endorse the use of self-defense. If we turn over to Luke 22, verses 35 to 38. 22. Oh, that's Matthew. All right, Matthew 22, verses 35 to 38. Do we have someone who wants to read that? All right, Dad.
Okay. And he said to them, when I sent you out with no money bag or knapsack or sandals, did you lack anything? They said, nothing. He said to them, but now let the one who has a money bag take it, and likewise a knapsack. And let the one who has no sword sell his cloak and buy one. For I tell you that this scripture must be fulfilled in me. And he was numbered with the transgressors. For what is written about me has its fulfillment. And they said, look, Lord, here are 2 swords. And he said to them, it is enough.
Thank you. So here Jesus is telling his followers, not just his average followers, but like these are the apostles, the men who will be the apostles on Pentecost. He tells them that with his death approaching, and he's soon going to be gone from them, that it's time for them to sell their cloaks and buy a sword. You don't buy a sword if you're not at least considering there are cases in which you're going to have to use lethal force.
A pacifist could argue that it would only be for animals.
Yeah,
Throw that in.
I would disagree. There's nothing to indicate such a restriction.
I was just thinking a soldier is not seeking or partaking in revenge. They are an arm of the government. So when we think of somebody, the army, it's the government. So I'm not sure how the pacifists
Yeah.
think on that, but they're not. It's not somebody going out for revenge.
Well, yes and no, because it's not like a person seeking revenge for themselves, but like the civil authority is supposed to be God's avenger, is the specific term used. Joan, then Dad.
That when like Peter chopped that one guy's ear off, Jesus like rebuked him for it, and so they could say, well,
You live by the sword. You die by the sword.
yeah, like he rebuked him for hurting a human, but that so it makes sense that they would have the weapons free.
And I'll get to that in a moment because I have something I want to bring up with that.
To Tony's point, when people who hold to a pacifist philosophy, they often don't have a problem with the government doing it, but then they say, we're of a kingdom that's not of this world, and therefore I'm not participating in that government as a Christian. And that's where they are coming from. The problem with that is then you're stating that no Christian can be involved in the government, and now you have a government run completely by secularists.
Yeah, and
which is a dangerous thing.
I have something else to say on that point as well. To finish this up here, when Jesus is talking about them selling their cloak to buy a sword, they say, "Lord, here we have 2 swords," and he says that's enough. What I read that as is Jesus is doing something different from the people who in the past had claimed to be false messiahs. Virtually all of them, because the Jews expected that a Messiah was going to be a military leader who was going to set the Israelites free from the Romans. They would be preparing to engage in armed rebellion. Jesus is being markedly different from those false messiahs in saying that 2 swords is enough. He's saying it's enough to defend a group of 12 robbers, vagabonds, people who'd be trying to come after them outside the law. If the civil authority were trying to arrest them and they send soldiers out, 2 swords isn't going to do anything.
Right.
And at that point, it's like, okay, go with them, hope for the best, hope for fair trial. I'll get you in just a moment. But Jesus is I think, setting up a distinction here between self-defense and what past false messiahs would have done in trying to set up an armed rebellion. And some of what we see later on with, as Joe mentioned, Jesus rebuking Peter for using the sword at the Garden of Gethsemane, I think that mostly has to do with the circumstances Peter was using it in that case. This was Jesus' time to go to the cross. It wasn't a time to be opposing the civil authority, which is what Peter would have been doing by cutting off the high priest's ear. And there were bigger things afoot in that particular case, and that's why Jesus rebuked Peter at that time. Now, getting to a point Dad brought up about many pacifists would say that because our kingdom is not of this world, yes, the civil authority is allowed to use violence, but we as Christians are not supposed to. There's a couple problems with this. The main problem being we have multiple examples of Christians as civil authorities throughout the Bible, particularly the book of Acts, but even in the Gospels. Pop quiz, who was it about whom Jesus said that he had not seen any faith like it in Israel? What man had faith? Yeah, it was the centurion, a Roman centurion, not just a local law enforcement officer. We're talking about a military commander. And Jesus says that he was impressed with the centurion's faith. First Gentile convert. Do you guys remember who the first Gentile convert is? Cornelius. What was his job?
Another centurion.
He was also a centurion. Acts chapter 13. There's a man that becomes a believer because of things that Paul does in opposing a Jewish false prophet. This man is named Sergius Paulus. He's the proconsul of Cyprus. A proconsul is a type of Roman governor that would have been responsible, or they're usually directly under appointment of Roman consuls, which are not one-for-one president, but they have similarities to a president in their control over the military, and the proconsul would have been a local guy in charge of the military in the area, like a governor, unless the consul in Rome were to say otherwise. And then lastly, in Acts, I think it's 14, we see the Philippian jailer, who he and his entire family become Christians. The jailer is far from a pacifist job. You have to use force all the time. You're an extension of the government's force in keeping people confined ideally for crimes. In Paul and Silas's case, not so much. But there's a bunch of different men we see become Christians in Acts and in the Gospels, and whose faith is even commended by Jesus. These are men who were engaged in violence by virtue of their position in the government. I think from all that we can see in the Bible, there is no clear mandate to be pacifist and refrain from all violence, or even to stay away from government offices altogether. On the contrary, we see a few select examples, even some endorsed by Jesus, and Christian converts whose jobs would have required them to take violent action. Now, obviously some pacifists might say, well, after they converted, they could have left those jobs. We have no indication that that ever happened. We don't have an example of basically, that would be a speculative argument. There's no example of that happening in Scripture.
We even have the example of soldiers coming to John the Baptist, and they're converted, they're repenting, and he says, don't extort money and be content with your pay, which means you stay in your position. Yeah. He's not asking them to leave their position. If he says, be content with your pay, he expects them to remain soldiers, but to just do it honorably.
Yeah. And one last reason I think that pacifism is not part of the Christian life is it does interfere with one's duty to protect the innocent. For example, and I've kind of hinted at an example like this. Can you imagine a pacifist police department? How many cities do we have that are getting close to that right now? But in general, that is something that in our minds would seem ridiculous. Now, take that to the household, a pacifist husband or father who is supposed to be, we see from the Bible, one of the jobs of the husband and the father is to protect his family. And if you have, if the father or husband is a pacifist, that could lead to potential conflict. When it maybe not if someone's threatening you directly, but what if someone's threatening your wife or your children and you're a pacifist? There's going to be a major conflict between a duty set in the Bible and the ideas behind pacifism. So I think there's going to be conflict loving your neighbor, essentially. So those are some of the problems I see with pacifism, why I think when we're following the sixth commandment, it's a bit of an overcorrection to say, in light of that, no violence is permitted. We very clearly see select cases in which violence is permitted. We need to have the wisdom to understand when that's going to happen and when we don't need to. The passage of turning the other cheek, that's a passage about needing to exercise the wisdom to know, is there an insult, or is this just an insult? Do I ignore it, suffer it, go on, or am I in danger here? Do I need to defend myself or someone close to me?
Along with that, I think it's important to mention, you had mentioned proportionality earlier. And once there's no longer any danger or any real danger, you need to cease.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where people mess up. And someone may be breaking into your house, you fire a couple of shots and they run. Well, you don't go out the door and shoot them in the back at that point. You're asking for trouble for yourself, but you're also, taking a life when at that point it's done.
Yeah.
And the same, you have someone on the ground and they've been detained and you're waiting for the police. You don't need to choke them out till they're dead or something like that. You just have to use restraint and wisdom and be proportional in your response and try to uphold life as much as possible.
Yeah. Now, speaking of upholding life, this leads to the second topic that I wanted to talk about this morning. And that would have to do with abortion. Now, I will mention a couple descriptions that I'm going to mention in a moment aren't exactly pleasant descriptions, but I think they are relevant and helpful for us understanding what exactly is happening. So I think if we read the sixth commandment, it should be pretty clear. If murder is the unjustified taking of an innocent human life, then abortion should be out of the question. It should easily be considered murder. It is the intentional taking of pretty much the most innocent, defenseless human life possible. Sorry, I almost made a snide remark about Calvinism, but I will refrain at this time. And this is part of the rougher description. I think it's important to understand what is actually happening with abortion, because so often in common parlance, it's just a procedure or it's a pill, and we don't really think about it. It's healthcare. It happens in a clinic somewhere. The main three ways that abortion happens, two are by procedure, one is by pill. The two procedures, the first one is to actually dismember and crush the child while it's a fetus and then bring it out. The second way is they will try to inject, I think it's usually a salt solution that essentially poisons and dehydrates the fetus, and then they induce delivery of a stillborn child. And then the other version, this is the most common version now. I believe it's about 70% of all abortions are now just done by pill, mail order pill. Pretty much any woman can buy this in any state. And while it has been good to see a lot of states banning the procedural forms of abortion, a lot more work needs to be done to ban the pill version, because almost no one has tried to come up with fixing that or with addressing that problem yet. So hopefully we see some improvement there. But what happens with that is there's two pills, mifepristone and misoprostol. The first one cuts off nutrients, blood flow, and oxygen to the child while it's in the womb, and changes the uterine lining so that it can't become what would otherwise be a stable growing baby. And then the other one causes something like an induced delivery. But the worst part of these two is if it's done early enough, it can be done in the home. The other troublesome part of it is that side effects of it are never really discussed, honestly. It can lead to major bleeding, major cramping, all kinds of complications. Usually mentioned or discussed honestly by their providers. So we see that this is I think I think it should be self-evident this is a grave evil to anyone who actually looks at what's happening to these. That's why they say whenever they show an ultrasound, the chances that a mom chooses life over abortion goes up by like 90%. In 90% of cases, when they show a ultrasound, the mom will change her mind about abortion.
I actually don't think it's that high anymore. It's gone down, unfortunately.
Maybe I have not seen particular evidence of that. The most recent numbers I have are still around the 90s. So with that, there's a couple. Basically, excuse me. There are liberal, so-called Christian denominations that will try to justify abortion. And I want to, in the remaining time, try to address some of those arguments that they make. And the way that they generally do it, so our definition of murder, the unjustified taking of an innocent human life, the way that they try to make it not fall under unjustified, usually the first way is to say that, well, it's not really human life as we would consider it, and so that means that it's permissible. Usually it has to do with personhood. Now, I think there's a couple problems with this. Number one, there's a snuck argument in there that personhood and being created in the image of God are going to be the same thing. That's not necessarily true. I've never actually seen an argument saying that those would be the same thing. Just because, even if it were true that personhood or human life did not begin until the umbilical cord is cut and the child starts breathing on his or her own, even if that were to be proven true, I don't think you can still prove from that they're not created in the image of God. So I say all that to say, even in their best scenario, they don't prove it. But as we all know, this main argument that they'll come up with is that it's the child in the womb is not a full person. And it could be for a couple different reasons. One, they'll say that, well, it's too small, it's not fully developed,
Live outside the womb.
it can't, because of its environment, can't live outside the womb, or because it's completely dependent for life, they're not an independent life itself. These arguments don't really, do not really disprove personhood. Bigger or smaller size does not determine worth as a person. I am not worth more or less as a person than Shaquille O'Neal. Okay, my dad would say he's worth way more. But
Not to me, though. But,
joking aside, well, he's worth a lot more in his bank account.
yeah, that's what I mean.
Okay, I missed the first joke on that. But in terms of worth as a human being and made in the image of God, there's no difference between me and someone bigger or smaller. We're all made in the image of God. Level of development, this again is just assuming that once someone's come out of the womb, they don't develop anymore. That's a frankly ridiculous assumption. Your grandkids, Gabe, and I can't remember his sister's name, Maddie, they're going to be, God willing, they'll be developing for at least another 25 years. My brain, in theory, on average, still has 3 more years before it's considered fully developed.
We could only hope.
Yeah. The long and short of it is, development does not stop in the womb. It continues after the child is born. Environment, where you are does not, your location, it doesn't matter if I'm here, if I'm in China, if I'm in Italy. Where I am location-wise, inside or outside my mother's womb, doesn't change worth. And then finally, dependence. And they say that because the child is completely dependent on the mother while it's in the womb, it's not a full separate human life. But do you know who else is quite dependent on the mother outside the womb? Infants. Once they're outside the womb, they're pretty much just as dependent as they were before for nourishment, for support, basically everything. You don't see a kid come out of the womb and start working a 9-to-5 job. They don't support themselves. They don't have that ability. That's not real. um, there's no strong arguments to say that there's a distinction between personhood before the child is born or after the child is born. And as I mentioned before, even if you could somehow prove that, one cannot simply assume that personhood and imago Dei are exactly one-for-one thing. That the child in the womb still created in the image of God, distinct from any animals. That the child, when it's a fetus, is not going to grow into some kind of animal. It is going to grow into a human. Nothing is going to change that. That's another argument I would have against abortion, is that we don't know when ensoulment happens. That's something that's information that is not privy to us, probably for reasons such as this. And my caution would be to say, don't mess with it.
I would say we do know because when a body is dead and there's no biological function left there, the Bible indicates that the soul has left. So the moment that was alive and there was biological function, I think we need to say that the soul was connected. And we know when that happens, and it does happen at conception. So while we can't say 100% for certain that that's when it occurred, that's really the only legitimate option we have.
Yeah. And at conception, you're going to have unique DNA no one else in history is going to have again.
And then at that point, there's so much in the Bible. I knit you together in your mother's womb.
A passage that I had prepared coming up.
You want to mention it, but I mean, it's while it's in the womb that he's knit together. So when are you knit together? It's when the two parts are fused, and the life begins, and it grows from there.
Yeah. I'll just read real quickly. This is Psalm 139, showing the incredible design God brings about in the womb. It says, "For you formed my inward parts, you wove me in my mother's womb. I will give thanks to you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, and my soul knows it very well." The Bible is incredibly clear that prior to birth, God is still at work. And the idea that we would have the right to interfere with such work of God is, I think, both preposterous and evil. Another argument that they'll try to make, well, they'll try to say, and this is kind of conflating their terms with other terms, because pro-abortion people often call themselves pro-choice. They'll say, well, in the Bible, we see God as very clearly a God of choice. He's giving people choices all the time. That argument just implies that this is the kind of choice that God gives us to make, without going into further detail as to whether it's offered to us or not. B, God gives choices all the time. And it's very clear in Deuteronomy, we'll read later, at one point, Moses talks about the Israelites having a choice between life and death, and he tells them to choose life, and they're not supposed to choose death. And if the same kind of choice is being offered here, well, then we as Christians have to choose life. Number two, when we're given choice in the Bible, very often there are a myriad of ways to choose wrongly and only one way to choose rightly. The number of choices God actually endorses us making in the Bible compared to the range of choices we could make is vanishingly small. Some of that, I don't have that fully developed yet. I have another argument I've been thinking on, but it's not fully developed yet. No. And then with argument number 3, also a little bit related to justification, though abortion supporters will try to argue that the exceptions, such as rape, incest, deformity, life of the mother, that creates a justification by which we can take human life. And again, there's really no support for this in the Bible or otherwise. Number one, if we start with the life of the mother being in danger, what do most doctors try to do? You try to save both lives. There's two lives being worked on, the life of the mother and the life of the baby. Number two, with deformity, that no reason why someone having a particular illness should justify killing them. Christians throughout history have been known not for killing the sick, but for offering aid to the sick. Hospitals, the profession of nursing almost in its entirety are started by Christians in ages past. That's kind of the thing that we're known for. So for Christians, deformity is by no means a justification. And then lastly, rape or incest. So obviously two horrible things, but the question is, does that give justification? Well, if we take rape, for instance, when we think of who's guilty, if a man rapes a woman, the man's obviously guilty. The Old Testament would say he deserves the death penalty. I think the New Testament would follow along with that. Number two, is the woman guilty? Definitely not. That would be ridiculous. Then a child created through rape, is the child guilty or innocent? The child literally did nothing at all. And to say that the circumstances of his or her conception equates to a justification to kill an innocent being, it's ridiculous. It would be conferring a type of punishment that today our civil authority fails to exercise on the rapist in over 99% of cases.
Charlie Kirk would say someone in this room was born as a result of rape.
Like statistically.
Yeah, can you tell me who it is?
Yeah.
And the answer is no, you can't.
And I'll say, for context, he's usually saying that in a room of like 5 to 10,000 people.
No, even in a room of...
Well, sometimes more.
Yeah, maybe like 500 people or something. One would be...
Yeah, like you can't... There's no marker of it. There's no distinction for that child once it happens. There's no difference in their worth or their life. So, all that to say, I think it's frankly shameful that some leaders within other Christian denominations will try to justify abortion. I think it's something that needs to be pointed out and opposed at every possible opportunity. Now, as for the Christian view, what should we do in light of struggles over the lives of the unborn? Well, the Christian view, I think, is quite simply to love our neighbor as ourselves, help people choose life, give support to young mothers who may need help and support. And I'm very proud our church does do this. We work very closely with the Women's Choice Network and Network of Life here in Pittsburgh. We just had the toy drive a couple weeks ago to help spread a little Christmas cheer. And I'll just mention in terms of success that the organizations that we support for that, Women's Choice Network, they said over 450 moms have chosen life in the last calendar year. They don't have the numbers for this year yet because we still got about 10 days left on it. They did increase? Okay. Well, that's good. Because last year alone, they saved 112 babies. So if that's up, that's even more. So I'm real proud that our church can be a part of that. A lot of abortion activists will try to claim that pro-life people or Christian people that support pro-life causes don't care about the baby once it's born. They only care about once the child is born, and then they don't care anymore. And usually they're using that as an emotional cudgel to support particular social benefits programs, which A, is a scummy practice for arguing policy, and B, patently untrue. Pro-life groups and pro-life Christians especially, who make up the largest contingent of the pro-life movement, do more to help babies and young mothers after birth than any other group. I mean, Planned Parenthood doesn't have support stuff for after because usually they expect that the child's going to be killed. Pro-life centers that help young mothers
They don't
choose
do
life and
any
deliver the
abortion
baby,
counseling either.
yeah, they don't do that. They'll pro-life centers, if a woman does have an abortion, realizes her mistake, and then has the crushing weight of guilt, pro-life centers are the ones that offer the counseling and assistance services for after to help them along the path of repentance, hopefully turn them towards God. I'll get you in a moment. But pro-life clinics, the churches that support them and all that, are for charity in that realm than any other group. It's one of the most patently false claims in American civil discourse today, and frankly, I think a disgusting one
They try to use
to
law
deny it. Yeah, and they will also try to use law to shut down pro-life clinics and all that. So there's a lot to say on this. There's more that could be said, but we're running short on time now. You had something.
The Woman's Choice Network. Call it the fourth trimester. Obviously, tri means 3 days. Very much support afterwards, and continually tell these people, you need help. Keep calling us back. We're not done just because you delivered your baby.
You mentioned David's psalm. Luke talks about the baby being recognized in the word. Paul does, and Jeremiah. And also, when the angel left Mary, it said she hurried to the hills of Judea to be with Elizabeth. You can make that trip from Nazareth to the Judean area in 3 days. So she was newly conceived, and when she got there, Elizabeth said, and how has it happened to me that the mother of my Lord would come to me? So they recognized, within days, Jesus was recognized as being a baby, and they said, oh, no, that's just a bunch of cells. That's not right.
Well, and then the even cooler part of that story is John the Baptist,
Right.
still in the womb, recognizing Jesus is nearby. It says that he leaps in the
As soon as
womb.
he heard Mary's voice. I mean, that's a person. God calls it a person.
Yeah. And I mean, you can point to all kinds of personal or documented examples. Babies respond to voices in the womb. They'll hear when people around are talking, then they'll come out of the womb. They'll be able to recognize their mom and their dad's voice. So to deny their personhood just because they're small and maybe out of sight, out of mind is just wrong. And then to the Women's Choice Network, again, I've seen they have a thrift shop next to one of their main clinics on the north side of Pittsburgh. And if a woman with a baby comes in and needs help, they have a side door that connects between the two parts, and they'll basically give whatever kinds of clothing she needs for the little kid. And they go up to like 8 years too. They have might be up to 12 years old is when they keep clothing up to. So yeah, a lot of good stuff conversation. We'll go ahead, if there's no other questions, we'll go ahead and close with prayer. Father in heaven, we're grateful for this day that you've blessed us with to come and learn from your word. We're thankful that you've given this wonderful gift of life to us, and it's wonderful to get to reflect on it in learning the sixth commandment. Help us to honor and respect and choose life more and more. And it's in your son's name we pray and give you thanks. Amen.